Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Claims by Israel and the US that Iran lied about its nuclear program are causing international disagreement.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claims he has proof Tehran is still attempting to develop nuclear weapons, a view the EU and the UK disagree with.
It comes ahead of a decision by President Trump over whether to walk out of the Iran nuclear deal. Our Middle East correspondent Alex Rossi reports.
And here's what we got.
This was, according to the Israeli Prime Minister, one of the country's biggest intelligence hauls of all time. Benjamin Netanyahu revealing a shelf of files and CDs containing thousands of documents obtained by Israeli agents. All this, he claimed, proves that Iran lies and is continuing to lie about its nuclear program.
Why would a terrorist regime hide and meticulously catalog its secret nuclear files if not to use them at a later date?
Israel has consistently opposed the Iranian nuclear deal as dangerous. Under the 2015 agreement, Iran agreed to curb its nuclear program in exchange for a lifting of sanctions. But before Mr. Netanyahu had even said a word, he was accused of carrying out a stunt. The Iranian foreign minister tweeted that this was another example of the boy who cried wolf, a reference to a memorable speech in 2012 in which the Israeli Prime Minister addressed the UN General Assembly on the dangers of a nuclear Iran and used a cartoon bomb to make his point. But the timing of this latest reveal is interesting and lays the groundwork for Donald Trump. The US president says unless the nuclear deal is fixed, he'll withdraw from the agreement.
They're not sitting back idly. They're setting off missiles, which they say are for television purposes. I don't think so. So we'll see what happens. I'm not telling you what I'm doing, but a lot of people think they know.
Israel and Iran have long been enemies, and in recent months the conflict between them has broken out into the open. On Sunday, a large attack in northern Syria on what are thought to have been Iranian targets was blamed on Israel, although the IDF refused to comment. Iran has sent thousands of fighters into Syria to support President Assad, but Israel claims it's using the country as a staging post to build forces to attack the Jewish state. Benjamin Netanyahu's televised primetime speech will be seen by many as largely political, but there's also a subtext that is very explicit. Iran will not be allowed to continue to expand militarily on Syrian soil, and if the world does not act, Israel will. Alex Rossi, Sky News, Jerusalem.
Well, let's get more now from Alex Rossi, who is in Jerusalem for us. And Alex, this was obviously very much pitched at international viewers, but I wonder what the reaction's been in Israel to this.
Yeah, very much at international viewers. It was interesting when he made the presentation that he started speaking in English and then moved to Hebrew. It was taken by all of the Israeli networks here. I think many people in Israel will go along with the Prime Minister. They will agree that it is an absolute must that Iran should not get the nuclear bomb. It's pretty much accepted here that a nuclear Iran is an existential threat to the Jewish state. Now, in terms of the actual intelligence haul, highly significant according to the Israelis and absolutely massive. It really is a huge espionage feat, according to Benjamin Netanyahu. About 500 tons of files, documents and CDs was managed to be spirited away or stolen by the agents from Mossad. So very significant in those terms. But in terms of the actual Iranian nuclear deal, how is it persuading things? How is it moving the argument? Well, it's quite interesting here that amongst many in the Israeli defense establishment and also in the intelligence establishment, they believe that the world is actually better off with the nuclear deal. And the reasoning behind that is very similar to that of the British and also the French. The fact is, the world knew that Iran had a covert military nuclear program that was active up until 2003, despite the fact that it was denying it. So the reason to continue with the nuclear agreement is the argument is that the best way of deterring them, of stopping them, all right, it's not going to be forever, but it will be for the next 10 or 15 years, is to carry on with the agreement. I don't think Benjamin Netanyahu will have persuaded people otherwise with the presentation, but it was much more than that. It wasn't really about persuading people. What it was about was laying the groundwork for the US President Donald Trump, who has indicated that he is going to withdraw from that agreement, the Vienna Agreement signed in 2015. Now remember, a US president can't just say, I am ripping up that document because I don't like it because it was signed by my predecessor. As the head of a rational state, for diplomatic reasons, he needs evidence, he needs justification. And this, in inverted commas, is the evidence he needs if he decides, which he has indicated he will, that he withdraws from that agreement by May the 12th.
OK, Alex, thanks very much for that. Well, let's just get a look at what the Iran deal actually does entail. Iran was openly enriching uranium for years, and it said it was for nuclear power, but the world believed Iran had a secret nuclear weapons program. In July 2015, Tehran struck a deal with the UK, the US, China, Russia, France and Germany and the EU to curb its nuclear program in exchange for crippling economic sanctions to be lifted. Under the deal, it was allowed to continue enriching uranium, but only enough to provide nuclear power, and it agreed to get rid of its stockpile of uranium. Iran also agreed to redesign a reactor that was capable of producing weapons-grade plutonium and to ship out any plutonium that was produced. Well, inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency have been allowed to visit Iran's nuclear sites and ensure enrichment activities are purely for energy and not for weapons. In return, all sanctions on Iran, including its oil, banks, shipping and aviation, have been lifted, and they can be reinstated if Iran breaks any part of the deal. But the US President Donald Trump has described the deal as terrible and said that he'll decide by the 12th of May whether or not to pull out of it. Well, joining us now from Central London, Jason Perlman, Deputy Director of the Henry Jackson Society, a right-wing foreign policy think tank. And Henry, Jason even, third time lucky. Jason, do you think that this evidence that Israel has unveiled jeopardises the deal? Does it show that Iran has gone back on its word?
I think, firstly, we're not specifically right-wing. We represent many different views. But one view that comes out of this issue specifically is that Iran simply has not been trustworthy in its approach to the international community, in its approach to this deal. So does it jeopardize the deal? This is the question. We've had European leaders visit the White House. We've had Macron, we've had Merkel. We've had the US Secretary of State visit Israel for just a few hours the other day. The response that President Trump will now put together, whether he brings America out of this deal, whether he doesn't sign the sanctions waiver, is really down to one thing, and that is, can Iran be trusted? You say, you know, the evidence is there, they continue to enrich uranium, but ultimately they're continuing to develop missiles that are not just being used in Iran, but are also ground mobile. These are missiles that can be shipped to Hezbollah, can be shipped to the Houthis in Yemen. These are tools for destabilization, and that's really what stands at the crux of this issue.
But in terms of this information that Israel currently has, Haaretz, one of the Israeli newspapers today, said this isn't so much a smoking gun, but a photo of a smoking gun and a photo of a smoking gun which is out of date. I mean, this doesn't show that Iran have gone back on the terms of the agreement from when the agreement was written, does it?
I mean, it's fair to say that there is little in this information, the intelligence that's been gathered, is specifically new. But again, Prime Minister Netanyahu...
And I thought it was all... My understanding was that this was all prior to the agreement. So this is showing that perhaps Iran may not have been trustworthy in the past, but it doesn't show that they've gone back on the words of the agreement since it was written.
Quite right. There's a strong argument for that. But again, I don't think that the presentation that Prime Minister Netanyahu put on in Jerusalem last night was specifically necessarily about the information that was there. It's much more a question of, rather than what, it's a question of when and how. When after this flurry of diplomatic meetings in the run-up to this crucial moment in the signing of the agreement, the renewal of the agreement. Also, very crucially, how, it was in English, it was prime-time television, it's been shared by the Israeli Prime Minister's office in multiple formats to journalists all over the world. This is really a question of how much pressure can Israel raise to ensure that if the deal is renewed, it comes with at least some sort of insurance or assurance that Iran won't be able to continue to threaten Israel, whether from their own borders or indeed from Lebanon and Syria. And how much can the international community rely on Iran? And based on the evidence that put forward by Israel yesterday, it's very difficult to rely on them at all.
I mean, Netanyahu has used this idea before, hasn't he? We've all seen the pictures of him holding up the bomb picture at the United Nations. Does it actually work? I mean, it's interesting telly, and it certainly makes something which is a foreign affairs issue that a lot of people don't quite fully comprehend. It makes it very accessible and very straightforward. But does it actually change policy?
Well, this is Prime Minister Netanyahu's format. He's done it. It's very theatrical. He's done it on explaining Israel's diplomatic relations. He's done it from every issue that you can imagine. And it's always slightly new, and it's always slightly different, and it garners the attention. And ultimately, to answer your question, we're talking about it now. So I could argue it perhaps it does. And
President Trump, what's your instinct? Do you think he'll pull out of the deal?
I wonder if perhaps there's a middle ground here. I think perhaps there will be some sort of restrictions on the sanctions. At the moment, Iran is able to sell oil at the amount of hundreds of millions of dollars a day, perhaps. And the question has to be asked also by the international community, is that money going to help the people in Iran, or is that going to build up, a war machine? That's, I think, a question that President Trump will be considering very carefully. I think that we may well see a decision by the White House to withdraw ultimately from the deal.
OK. Jason Perlman, Deputy Director of the Henry Jackson Society, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The UN atomic watchdog has refused to comment on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's accusations that Iran is breaching its landmark nuclear deal. Israel has stepped up pressure on the United States to pull out of the 2015 deal, presenting evidence of a secret Iranian nuclear weapons program. We're live to Central London, where we can speak to Matthew Moran, a reader in international security at King's College London. Thanks for joining us today, Matthew. Just how high are the stakes here?
Well, actually, I think the first thing to say is that the information that Prime Minister Netanyahu presented is not as groundbreaking as he'd like to have us think, because a lot of that information was already known. The international community knew that Iran had lied about its nuclear activities, and that was why the nuclear deal that's currently in effect was, that was why people pushed so hard for that deal. But stakes are considerable. The Israeli Prime Minister has never been a fan of the deal and is trying to feed into this discussion that's going on in the US primarily at the moment about whether President Trump will do his part to undermine the deal.
And on that point, I mean, how significant is the timing of Prime Minister Netanyahu's presentation?
I mean, the timing, Prime Minister Netanyahu, your viewers might recall back in 2015 at the UN, he presented this cartoonish image of a bomb, etc. He's quite flamboyant. He's doing this. It's a calculated move. It's, to try and influence President Trump's thinking. But I think it's also important to bear in mind that there are domestic issues at stake here as well. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to deflect from the corruption scandal that he is facing at home and send a message to Israelis that, he is the man that they need to deal with this ever-looming Iranian threat.
Iran has today called Prime Minister Netanyahu an infamous liar over the allegations. So what is likely to happen now? Because the deadline for President Trump to make his decision on whether to stay into the nuclear program is the 12th of May.
Yeah, well, I mean, the 12th of May would see if it's the 12th of May is significant because President Trump has to decide whether to waive certain sanctions. But there's another date following that in July where another batch of sanctions would need to be waived. So this would certainly undermine the deal if President Trump took that decision. But I think, it's very important to bear in mind that why the nuclear deal was put in place was because people were aware of Iran's past activities, and this is about this is the most intrusive inspection regime ever sort of implemented in the non-proliferation context, and it's about detecting any undeclared activity and deterring Iran from going down that path again. So, it's important to bear that in mind.
So do you think Iran did have a nuclear weapons program? And if so, the findings by the Israeli intelligence services would be seen as a major coup?
I mean, it certainly is a coup for Mossad, for the Israeli intelligence services, to acquire all this documentation. But like I said, I don't think the information that's coming out is particularly new. We were already aware that Iran had misled the international community about its activities. So there's nothing new there. What we're getting, certainly from the public perspective, is perhaps more clarity. But I think intelligence agencies around the world were very much aware of Iran's activities prior to 2003.
Do you think the nuclear deal will survive without the support of the United States?
And that's very difficult to say. I mean, President Macron from France, you've Germany also trying to convince President Trump to stay with the deal, to stick with the deal, because this is a non-proliferation success, and it has been. But it's very difficult to say what will happen if Trump goes down this path, because remember, there are constituencies of interest in Iran as well who would like to see the deal fail. So there are domestic audiences on all sides who are watching carefully. Predicting the future is quite difficult, but from my perspective at least, this is an important non-proliferation deal and it's worth saving. President Macron has sort of put forward this idea of, use the deal that's there and build on that deal going forward, rather than getting rid of this deal with no real plans for any replacement at present.
A very interesting statement from Sarah Huckabee Sanders yesterday that Iran did have a weapons program, and then she very quickly changed it to had a weapons program. What can we read into that? I mean, they say that was just a technicality and just a bit of miswriting, but do you think that was the case?
Well, we're not privy to the inside sort of dealings of the Trump administration. But all I can say is the information in the public sphere suggests that, yes, Iran was engaged in activities relevant to a nuclear weapons program prior to 2003. From 2003 onwards, research that we've conducted here at King's College London suggests that the strategy was about nuclear hedging, putting themselves in a position where if they took the decision to do so, they could go nuclear very quickly.
Matthew Murren, interesting talking to you. Thanks for your time.
Let's tell you a bit more about this deal and what was agreed. Iran was openly enriching uranium for years. It said it was for nuclear power, but the world believed that Iran had a secret nuclear weapons program. So in July 2015, Tehran struck a deal with the UK, the US, China, Russia, France, Germany, and the European Union to curb its nuclear program in exchange for crippling economic sanctions lifting. Under the deal, it was allowed to continue enriching uranium, but only enough to provide nuclear power, and it agreed to get rid of its stockpile of uranium. Iran also agreed to redesign a reactor that was capable of producing weapons-grade plutonium and to ship out any plutonium that was produced. So, inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency have been allowed to visit Iran's nuclear sites, ensure enrichment activities are purely for energy and not for weapons. In return for all of that, sanctions on Iran, including on its oil, banks, shipping, aviation, were lifted. They can be reinstated if Iran breaks any part of the deal, but US President Donald Trump has described the agreement as terrible. He said he's going to decide by the 12th of May whether or not to pull the United States out of it. Let's get reaction from the US now. Speak to Mark Austin in Washington. Mark, did Prime Minister Netanyahu give any concrete evidence that Iran have broken this deal, and what does it mean for the watching President Trump?
No, not concrete evidence that they've broken this deal, which was introduced in 2015. It goes back some way before that. Now, it's all based, as you say, on this cache of files and documents that Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, somehow acquired from Tehran. They say it proves that Iran had a nuclear weapons program, that it wasn't for peaceful purposes, and they say it's all based on lies and deception. Now, the Americans today, the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has weighed in support of Israel, says it proves conclusively that they had this weapons program and that they were involved in what he called the systematic deception of the world. Now, note the use of the word had, because the Iranians say this is old news, this is history, things have changed. And the International Atomic Energy Agency, crucially, has said that they have seen no evidence of a nuclear weapons program in Iran since 2009. Now, separately, the Americans think this is a terrible deal for three reasons. One, it doesn't cover ballistic missiles. The second is they say the inspection regime is not tough enough. And third, they worry about what are called sunset clauses, which mean crucial restrictions on uranium enrichment expire in a decade or so. Donald Trump insists these should become permanent. Now, he has this date of May the 12th to decide whether to stay in the agreement or pull out. What's clear is that the Americans and the Israelis are using this find of these files and this cache of documents as a reason for pulling out of the deal. The Europeans, and Boris Johnson saying it today, say it's a reason for staying in the deal because the verification process within the deal is needed more than ever. What is Donald Trump going to do on or before May the 12th? Well, all the indications suggest that he is going to pull out. However, it may be that that is some sort of negotiating tactic. We know that President Macron of France and other Europeans, signatories to this deal, are talking to the Iranians, and it may be, just maybe, that there could be a broader deal that is acceptable to Donald Trump on ballistic missiles, tougher inspections, and the end to these sunset clauses. But it's only a maybe, because what's not known is whether Iran would really come to the table or just walk away. And if they walk away, we're back to square one, when the military option, which is always there, the military option, again, becomes one of the only options available. And as we know, and as we see yesterday, the Israelis are very skeptical about the deal, and there would be no question in my mind that they would be using a military option if this whole thing falls apart.
Now, on to Israel's Prime Minister. He's made the case against sticking with the nuclear deal that was made with Iran back in 2015. He presented thousands of documents seized by Israeli intelligence, which he says prove Iran plans to pursue an atomic bomb in the future. It all comes as President Trump decides whether or not to pull the United States out of that nuclear deal. Let's remind you what that deal actually entailed. Iran was openly enriching uranium for years. It said it was for nuclear power, but the world believed that Iran had a secret nuclear weapons program. So in July 2015, Tehran struck a deal with the UK, the US, China, Russia, France, Germany, and the European Union to curb its nuclear program in exchange for crippling economic sanctions being lifted. Under the deal, it was allowed to continue enriching uranium, but only enough to provide nuclear power, and it agreed to get rid of its stockpile at that time of uranium. Iran also agreed to redesign a reactor that was capable of producing weapons-grade plutonium, and they agreed to ship out any plutonium that was produced. Now, inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency have been allowed to visit Iran's nuclear sites and ensure that enrichment activities are purely for energy, not for weapons. In return, all sanctions on Iran, including oil, banks, shipping, aviation, were lifted. They can be reinstated if Iran breaks any part of this deal. But President Donald Trump has described it as terrible, said he's going to decide by the 12th of May whether or not to pull out of it. So there's the explanation. Joining us live from central London is the Guardian's Iran correspondent Saeed Kamali Dagan, and from Preston we're joined via Skype by Drew Lickerman, chairman of Republicans Overseas Scotland. Gentlemen, thank you. Drew, if I could start with you, what the Israeli Prime Minister showed us yesterday isn't evidence of Iran breaking the agreement, is it?
No, it's not evidence of Iran breaking the agreement. It's evidence of Iran lying at the negotiation table. And, you know, Iran breaking the agreement, they don't need to break the agreement. In a few years, Iran will be able to develop nuclear weapons. They will have all sanctions lifted. Iran is currently violating UN prohibitions on ballistic missiles. They're currently invading Yemen, Syria. They're sparking civil wars across the Middle East. So this Iran deal, they don't have to violate this Iran deal to create nuclear weapons in a few years and essentially turn the Middle East upside down on itself.
OK, Saeed, therefore the deal is almost meaningless because, as Drew describes, they'll be able to build nuclear weapons as soon as the deal comes to an end.
The deal is not meaningless. The deal is delivering Iran has abided by its obligations under the 2015 nuclear deal. The IAEA said today, even contradicting what Prime Minister Netanyahu had to say, that there is no evidence to suggest that Iran has continued its to work on the explosive device program after 2009. We have to remember 10 times the IAEA has said since 2015 that Iran has complied under the terms of that agreement. Instead, who in this party is not abiding by the rules is the US. Iran, as verified by the IAEA, has complied with the terms of the agreement. It has not seen the benefits. Today, there is not a single Tier 1 European bank which is ready to do business with Iran directly 3 years after that agreement. So, yes, of course, Iran's role in the Middle East is controversial, especially in Syria. But that agreement, the nuclear agreement, was not to address Iran's missile program. It was not supposed to address Iran's regional behavior. It was to address Iran's nuclear program, and it is doing it quite rigorously.
Yeah, Drew, when it comes to the actual deal and inspections by the IAEA, Asad says the Iranians are complying.
Oh, he's completely right. I mean, all we know, they are complying. The problem is the deal is so good that they can comply with the deal. They can ship billions of dollars of weapons to terrorist groups all across the Middle East, and they'll be able to build nuclear weapons within a few years. And on top of that, there's no sanctions right now. I mean, they're currently testing ballistic missiles that say on it, death to Israel, that they're firing ballistic missiles against UN orders. So he's right. I mean, that's the problem with the deal. The deal is so good for Iran. I mean, they get to rebuild their military. They get to run amok all across the Middle East. They get to test ballistic missiles, and they're going to get a nuclear weapon in a few years. That's the problem. The deal is so good for them. They're the only ones that win on the deal.
What do you think of that side?
The deal has been proved to be good for the other side. I mean, as I said, Iranians have not seen the benefits of the agreement. I mean, if Iran received any billions of dollars, it was Iran's money to begin with. We have to forget that these were Iranian assets frozen by the US. And you have to know that, I mean, see how the Europeans reacted to Prime Minister Netanyahu today. All of them were not welcoming his comments. They said that what it showed was that this agreement is working, that we need this agreement. It is not true that within a few years Iran is going to be able to develop nuclear weapons. What happened yesterday, the allegations that Prime Minister Netanyahu said, he said it from a country which has a few, at least 200 nuclear weapons, about a country that does not have any nuclear weapons. Iran has been, a member of the NPT, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, since 1970. Israel is not even a member of the NPT. We have to appreciate these nuances.
Yeah, Drew, what about the sort of non-coincidental timing of what the Israeli Prime Minister had to say yesterday? He knows President Trump is making that decision within the space of a week. He sees Iran, obviously, as you described, as a very, very hostile threat to the state of Israel. He knew what he was doing. He's essentially speaking directly to the US president, trying to make sure that he has his support, potentially, if they need to take out military action.
Well, look, of course he's speaking to the U.S. president. It's not just in Israel's interest. Iran sponsored the Beirut bombings, which killed 214 U.S. and French Marines. Iranian-backed Hezbollah has blown up synagogues in Argentina. Let's not flip this to talk about Israel. I mean, this Iran deal is a disaster. I mean, I'm not on here. I mean, of course, what Netanyahu showed, they showed that Iran lied about it. But, this isn't just about Israel. This is about Iran. I mean, they're sponsoring revolutions all across the Middle East with the money that we've shipped them. They're testing ballistic missiles, like I've said. And Iran is sponsoring terrorist groups that are murdering civilians all over the world. Like I said, whether it be Jewish worshippers massacred in Argentina by Hezbollah, or whether it be U.S. Marines in their barracks in their housing in Lebanon, and French Marines in Lebanon. So this deal is not about Israel. It's not about what Israel's weapons have or not. I mean, this is about an Iranian regime that's destroying the Middle East. I mean, we're trusting a regime that hangs gay people in the street. We're trusting a regime that has executed women for being raped. I mean, there's no fair comparison to talk about Israel when we're talking about what Iran is doing in the Middle East, what they're doing to their civilians, and what their proxies are doing all over the world.
Okay, Saeed, there's no comparison?
There is, I mean, when you're talking about the Middle East, it's a complicated picture, and to single out Iran is exactly the wrong thing to do. if you're talking about Yemen, you have to also talk about the Saudi role. Saudis, with help with the US and the UK, are bombing civilians in Yemen. Half of the country's health system has collapsed. There is no. I mean, if you're talking about the region, I mean, if you're talking, if you're teaching history about the Argentina bombing and others, you have to mention the other things as well. The US invasion of Iraq, what came first before where we are today in the region. You can't talk about Iran's role and not talk about Saudis, or not talk about even Israel's. What of course, what Prime Minister Netanyahu is talking about today helps him domestically as well. He's he's facing corruption charges. The Israel's treatment of Palestinians, for example. In the US, Trump is using by talking about Iran, he's trying to divert attentions from the dossier about Russia, for example. It's just to single out Iran in the region and blame Iran for everything, I think is absolutely the wrong message.
Just a final question to both of you. Drew first. Is President Trump going to pull out of this deal, do you think?
I would advise President Trump to pull out of this deal and renegotiate a new deal, or just leave this deal completely. So I don't know what Trump will do, but that's what I would do if I was the president.
Very quickly, if he does that, does he put himself under pressure with North Korea?
No, not at all. I think it sends a tough message to North Korea. If anything, I think it shows North Korea we're not messing around and we're not going to give you some lighthearted deal. So I think, if anything, pulling out of or strengthening the Iran deal just shows North Korea you're not going to walk easily.
OK, Saeed, what do you think? Is he going to pull out?
I mean, nobody knows. Last time when he signed the waivers, even his Secretary of State didn't know what his decision going to be. But I think if the US pulls out of this agreement, that all the other members of this agreement thinks that is delivering, I think it shatters the credibility of the West in the eyes of Iranians. For years, Iranian Ayatollahs, Iranian hardliners said that don't trust the West, don't trust the US. And for the first time, Iran has abided by the rules as verified by the IAEA, has not seen the benefits. And on one side, the US is ignoring the fact that it's an agreement between other nations as well, and pulling out without any substantial evidence.
OK, Saeed Kamali Dagan and Drew Lickerman, thank you very much for your time.
Now, Britain has urged the United States not to abandon the nuclear deal with Iran after Israel released documents claiming Tehran had lied big time about its nuclear weapons program. Boris Johnson said the deal was still vitally important to keep Iran's activities in check. But Donald Trump has signaled he could walk away from the agreement by May the 12th, unless there are significant changes. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman has this report.
Iran lied. Big time.
It was full of theatrical flourish. Israel's Prime Minister revealing copies of an intelligence haul, apparently showing that Iran lied about not having a nuclear weapons program. The evidence captured in a daring raid by Israeli agents earlier this year.
The Iran deal, the nuclear deal, is based on lies. It's based on Iranian lies and Iranian deception.
This may not be the bombshell it looks, because those who negotiated that deal knew the Iranians had previously lied. And today, European leaders said Israel had not proved that Iran is violating the nuclear deal now.
I have not seen from Prime Minister Netanyahu arguments for the moment on non-compliance, meaning violation from the Iran of its nuclear commitments under the nuclear deal.
Yesterday, Donald Trump was coy about whether he would allow the deal to expire in 11 days' time.
We'll see what happens. I'm not telling you what I'm doing, but a lot of people think they know.
Emmanuel Macron thinks he knows. He's now visiting Australia, and he said last week that he thinks President Trump will pull out, which makes the French leader the world's chief diplomat in terms of sorting out the aftermath. And Mr. Netanyahu, appearing on American TV shows this morning.
I'm very glad, I have to tell you, that President Trump has stood so firmly and so clearly on this issue.
The herald for what is to come.
My sources in Israeli administration and intelligence claim that they understood from their American counterpart that the decision has already been made, and Israel is trying to support that decision by I would say, putting out of the closet Iranian lies.
On Sunday, a Syrian filmed Israeli cruise missiles hitting Iranian targets in Syria. If you were predicting the next war in the Middle East, supposedly secret operations like this might be the beginning. Yesterday, Iran's supreme leader threatened to retaliate.
They know that if they enter hard military conflict with us, they will get bogged down. Yes, they may hit us, but they may well be hit back much more heavily.
What's more, if the nuclear deal collapses, Iran says it might restart its nuclear program.
We are going to go full force for restarting their nuclear program on a massive scale at all levels. So that's a possibility that Iran will do if the international community cannot deliver on their promises.
This commander-in-chief has nothing to replace the nuclear deal with. He's leaving that to Europe. It's a high-risk strategy, risking war in the name of peace.
Well, a short time ago, I spoke to the former US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who's just written a new book together with fellow Stanford political scientist Amy Ziegart from a single studio in New York called Political Risk. It explores a world in which dangers to Western democracies come not just Iran or Russia, but also from non-state actors online. I began by asking Ms. Rice whether she would pull out of the Iran deal.
Well, I have always said that I would not have signed the Iran deal because I think it had real problems in terms particularly of verification, but also the ability of the Iranians to break out later down the road. I probably would have stayed on, largely for relationship matters, for managing the alliance, but I do not think it is a tragedy if the president decides to withdraw from the Iran deal.
And you wouldn't be concerned that it would then give them a license to restart their nuclear program?
I think the Iranians came to this deal because they needed relief from sanctions. They would particularly, I think, hope that the Europeans will continue to relieve those sanctions, that there won't be new congressional sanctions. And so I actually think they have incentives to live with at least the spirit of this deal.
Amy Ziegart, in a sense, in talking to Condoleezza Rice, we're talking about kind of conventional threats that we've lived with for quite a long time. But in the book, it seems to me that you are now looking at shambolic threats, the internet, Twitter, all sorts of places where sort of misunderstandings, threats, abuse, the rest could lead to something different. Is that right?
That's right. What we found is that, 30 years ago, the big political risk to companies was a dictator expropriating their assets, like a Hugo Chavez. But now political risk is coming from a variety of different places. Sometimes it's government, sometimes it's Twitter users, sometimes it's local officials. And so what we've talked about recently is who would have ever thought that Facebook's biggest challenge, for example, would be from Vladimir Putin, sowing discord in the American democratic system and interfering in the election. So political risk is everybody's business now.
Well, Condoleezza Rice, that does raise the very specific issue of Facebook. We were involved in exposing Cambridge Analytica for the harvesting of and misuse of profiles from Facebook. How big a threat do you regard it as being?
Oh, I don't think that the social media platforms are a threat. I do believe that we're in a new world in which we have to understand better how they're being used, how they can be misused.
Well, perhaps not a threat within themselves, but a threat if abused and misused to, for example, Western democracy.
Yes.
I mean, do you disbelieve the idea that
Well,
the Russians
absolutely.
manipulated us?
Oh, no, I don't disbelieve in for a minute that the Russians manipulated and tried to manipulate our elections and certainly the information going into the elections. My goal for America is to actually figure out exactly what it is the Russians did, how they did it. My own view is the first time, shame on them. The second time, shame on us. We should be spending a lot of time understanding how these operations were carried out and protecting against them.
Can you contrast the threat that you experienced when you were in the administration with where we are today? Do you think the world is a more dangerous place than it was when you were serving George Bush?
Well, it was pretty dangerous when we were in office, when you consider that 3,000 people died on 9/11, and so it was a pretty dangerous place. Threats are multiplying. It is also true that they're changing. For instance, terrorism is no longer the purview of the kind of disciplined organization that Al-Qaeda was, but homegrown terrorists who are simply inspired by jihadist websites or jihadist rhetoric. And so.
Well, that was Condoleezza Rice talking to us from New York, and apologies there for the glitches on the line.
Much of the world spent today trying to digest a theatrical performance yesterday by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in which he used numerous graphics to lay out evidence he said Israeli intelligence had accumulated, showing that Iran had lied and had a nuclear weapons program. The suggestion was that the Iranians had broken the terms of the nuclear deal. It added ballast to President Trump's skepticism of the deal. But did Mr. Netanyahu offer new evidence of anything we didn't know? Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, is with me. Mark, people have been trying to work it out. There was a lot of CDs, a lot of files, and a lot of PowerPoint. What do you make of it all?
Well, look, I don't think too many people have been impressed or had their minds changed by this. There was a statement from the White House press secretary, Sarah Sanders, this evening, which I think the Israelis would have regarded as helpful, who said that the presentation had shown that Iranian work on nuclear weapons, which stopped in 2003, was further along than they had thought. That's about the most encouraging thing that anyone said today. The Iranian foreign minister said, Mr. Netanyahu, crying wolf again, that this is what he always does. And if one has to look at the arms control nerds, people connected with the IAEA, the nuclear watchdog, which went in to investigate those previously alleged elements of a nuclear weapons program, I think one can say there's been a pretty big collective raspberry blown to the whole thing today.
Okay. I mean, the big date actually is May the 12th, isn't it now? Because Donald Trump is saying he is sceptical of the deal and may, if you like, terminate American involvement in it come that date.
This comes round 6 monthly. Right. I think, look, if we know the way that President Trump thinks and we see the way, for example, he played the North Korea issue, he sees these as potential pressure points to leverage a better deal in the terms that he would see it. Now, of course, we've heard from France, another signatory today, and some of the other Europeans, the point of view that actually, no, this dossier that Mr. Netanyahu came out with actually underlines the continued need for it, because the deal has a dispute resolution mechanism. If you come across something which, as the press secretary of the White House today suggests they might have been further along than you'd thought, take it up through that mechanism, because if you junk it, you'll have nothing.
What have you got? Mark, thank you very much indeed. Well, joining me now from Washington is Jarrett Blanc. He worked in the US State Department while Barack Obama was president. His job, in fact, was trying to ensure Iran fulfilled its nuclear commitment. He now worked at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. A very good evening to you. Do you think Israel had anything credible yesterday to add to our knowledge of what Iran was up to? Do you think Israel gained credibility yesterday or perhaps lost it?
Well, certainly what's been announced publicly so far does not add anything substantial to our understanding of Iran's historical nuclear program. So the information may be credible, but it does not appear to be new. I think in an expert community, Israel has clearly lost credibility. If they had thought that they had serious information here, they would have treated it very differently, held it secret, mined the data for information that could be used to drive future IAEA inspections enabled by the JCPOA. But I think they had an audience of one person, President Trump, and they may well have gained credibility in his eyes with this theatrical presentation.
Right. JCPOA, I'll just remind everybody, is another name for the nuclear deal, the Iran deal. Look, the White House says it does prove something interesting, which is that the Iranians were further advanced than people had realized at the time the deal was signed. Do you buy that?
Well, they have access to the hundreds of thousands of pages of documents that Prime Minister Netanyahu claims to have. I don't. Right. From what's been said publicly, I would say that there's only very modest, if any, additional information. So there could be additional private information. If so, they have wasted a tremendous opportunity to drive better IAEA inspections. In the public realm, I don't see much new.
Right, okay. Do you accept that Iran has lied in the past? I'm not saying now, but would you accept that it has been a country that has lied about its nuclear activities?
Oh, certainly. Iran had a clandestine nuclear weapons program from 1997 until about 2003, 2004. They've denied it, so that's a lie. The reason that we built the JCPOA, the Iran deal, the way that we did was to allow invasive inspections in order to make sure that Iran was complying and accepting the limitations of the deal. It's not based on trust. It's not based on our belief that they're telling the truth. It's based on the world's most invasive inspection regime.
Let me ask you this, though. Do you think the desire to get a deal, the need to get a deal, the collective pressure to get a deal from Europeans and others involved in it, did push you along to sign something that was basically giving almost anything just to get a signature at the end of the day?
Oh, I absolutely would not agree with that assessment. Iran gave up 99% of their low-enriched uranium. They accepted strict limitations on their future enrichment program. They gave up 3/4 of their spinning centrifuges. They gave up the Iraq heavy water research reactor in a configuration that would have been able to produce plutonium. They accepted the most invasive inspection regime the IAEA currently has anywhere in the world. This is a very, very good deal, and has been repeated over and over again by the IAEA, by the US intelligence community, by allied intelligence communities. The deal is working and is both keeping Iran away from a clandestine nuclear program and also allowing a degree of confidence in the region and the world that Iran is not developing a nuclear weapon.
Let me put this last one to you. Some people will say of President Trump, he huffs and puffs a lot, he says a lot, he throws things around on Twitter or elsewhere, and occasionally it seems to move things along. Perhaps people would say he's done that with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Maybe he will extract an even better deal by these threats and the noise he's making and the attention he's throwing at this issue. Do you think there's any value in that?
I think it's just a fanciful story. If the United States were to reimpose sanctions unilaterally, the one thing I know is that there would be less pressure, economic pressure on Iran than there was before the deal, because we would be acting alone and not in conjunction with this broad range of international partners, including Russia and China, that got us to the deal. The idea that you can go from that point of lesser leverage to some sort of fanciful better deal, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And by the way, so far, I don't see North Korean concessions. I see a major US concession in the willingness to hold this summit. But I think that President Trump is getting some unwarranted credit, and certainly not any credit that should cast a positive light on his Iran policy.
Jared Blanc, thanks very much indeed for your reflections.
Thank you.